Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're going to be going over the King's Gambit Modern Defense. The King's Gambit, my favorite opening in all of chess, starts out with e4, e5, and then white plays f4, giving up a pawn in exchange for rapid development and some strong attacks against black. Now, the modern defense comes from the accepted line, which is pawn takes on f4, then knight to f3, rapid development from white, but black now strikes the center with pawn d5, and it has the same idea as the Fischer defense, which is pawn d6 to open up for the light square bishop to get involved. But d5 says, I'm just going to give back that pawn in material for my own rapid development, and I don't care about the extra pawn. I want to make sure that white's not the one with all of the initiative. Now, almost 95% of the time, white is going to take on d5. So in this video, we are going to look at what happens when white takes. We are going to play knight to f6, development move for our knight, controls the center of the board, attacks this pawn on d5. So the variations in this video we're going to be covering, the first one is c4, holding down this d5 pawn. We're also going to look at knight to c3, also trying to control this d5 square. You can start to see a theme here, bishop to c4, controlling this d5 square. And then lastly, if they don't even want to try to control that at all and just give us that material, that's fine. Maybe bishop to b5 that says, hey, this is check. You can't play your normal knight to c6. If you want to block off some of your material with something like bishop to d7, that's fine as well. So we'll look at that. So those are the four variations that we're going to look at in today's King's Gambit Modern Defense video. The first variation we're going to look at is if white plays c4. Now, I think this is the best line for white, but white also has to worry about a pretty bad pawn structure later in the game. And I think they end up losing a lot of endgames because of this. They end up with an isolated D pawn. And so for this reason, it is very tricky, even though it is what I think is the best line. We're always going to be playing pawn to c6, trying to put this in a tough spot. You always want to be attacking these central pawns here. And so doing that with c6 makes a lot of sense. I don't think they're really going to be taking here. If they do, hey, that's great for us. We can capture material while developing our knights. And so from here, if they play d4, opening up for their dark square bishop to take our pawn on f4, then we can just play bishop to b4, attacking their king, maybe knight c3, castle on the king side. Again, we don't even care about giving up some of this material. We have so many strong attacks here. Their knights being pinned down by our bishop to the king. We have both of our knight and our queen attacking this pawn right here. We can get our light square bishop involved into the game, pinning down their knight. So this is a pretty good spot. I just don't see white playing this poorly. So instead of just taking our pawn on c6, I do think there are some other options. One would just be knight to c3. Just building up pressure on this d5 square. If that's the case, we're just going to go ahead and take. And one of the threats that we have here as soon as we take is they always have to respond to our threats. We are the one with the initiative now, when typically when you think of the King's Gambit, white always has the initiative. Meaning that, let's say, white plays bishop d2. They look at the fact that we're being the aggressor, and so they want to castle on the king side, get some safety. Well, we can start to really put a lot of pressure on our opponent. d4 now attacks this knight. The knight doesn't have a lot of great squares. You can see the knight can't capture it because our queen would just come up and recapture. So that would be a pretty terrible spot. If they play something, knight to d5, we can just go ahead and take. They take. Now our queen takes on d5. And the queen in the center of the board usually is met with a knight coming to c3, attacking our queen, pushing it back. But now they don't have that option. Now our queen is in the middle of the board. We have a lot of pressure. Both of our pawns have crossed the halfway point. And you can see they're kind of stuck. The dark square bishop, it can't move anywhere. It's blocked by its own pawns. This bishop on e2 is blocked by the knight here. And so white has kind of a tough spot of how to actually get out of here. Black, on the other side, can easily develop all of its material. can castle on the king side, get some king safety. So this is going to be pretty easy, I think, development win for black. If they try something different, maybe instead of knight coming to d5, maybe they say, we can go ahead and check our opponents here, queen to a4. But then we can easily just stop that, bishop to d7. Now, this is a somewhat interesting line. It gets somewhat complicated. If they find this, I don't think they always would, but knight to b5, stopping that, pawn to a6, and then pawn d3. We can't just take it right away because then they could take our rook on a8, but instead, we can just play knight to c6. This now opens up. Now we can take the knight, so the knight has to move. But then we can just go ahead and play bishop to b4, check. Now bishop to d2, we can exchange here. We can go ahead and castle on the king side. Maybe they castle, and we play queen to e7, attacking this bishop on e2. And I think this is a much better setup for black. So that's what's going to happen if we see them not really responding to our initiative and try to play it safe. They really need to attack us back, not play something real quiet like a bishop to e2. So instead, I think they really should just be taking our pawn on d5. If that's the case, we're always going to respond by taking with our knight. We're not going to take with our queen. Obviously, that would be terrible. They could just take our queen here. But now they have some options. If they take with their knight, I think this is bad as well for many of the same reasons. We take with our queen and we have a central queen while we have the initiative, and they can't force our queen away. Now, if they decide that we're putting too much pressure, so they want to try to counterattack, maybe queen to a4, check. We're going to play knight to c6, getting more material involved into the game, also stopping their threat. Queen takes on f4. Yes, they have equalized in material, but now let's start to look at the position here. Both sides have 5 pawns, but white has an isolated pawn on the d-file. It's going to be a weakness for them they have to worry about. If they castle on the king side, they're still going to have a weakened king. The f pawn's not there, and black has the initiative. So even if white plays, d4, trying to counter in the center of the board, get their dark square bishop involved, black can castle on the queen side and put max pressure on the opponent. Doesn't even have to play it safe and castle on the king side. So always look at your chess games and figure out, if you have the initiative, how can you continue to be aggressive? Not just castle king side because you think you always have to castle king side. Sometimes you actually want to castle queen side, and this is a prime example of what that looks like. Now, if we come back, maybe they don't take with their knight. Maybe they decide to play something else. Bishop to c4. Attacking this knight. Okay, well, I recommend playing knight to b6. Now, the reason for this is our knight's under attack. We can take their knight on c3, but I think this lets them off the hook. The reason for that is they can take with their pawn, and they've now solved their problem of the weak pawn on the d-file, this isolated pawn. I don't like to let my opponent off the hook, and so because of that, I like to maintain pressure. So knight to b6 still attacks our opponent on c4. It also keeps the pressure with our queen open. Both of our bishops can get involved into the game, and we still have their dark square bishop completely blocked off. Okay, well, how do they respond from here? If they play bishop to b5, check. Okay, sure, we can go ahead and play bishop d7. They can trade off if they want to. That's completely fine. If they bring their bishop back, let's say bishop comes back to b3, then I like playing knight to c6. The reason I like knight c6 instead of something bishop d6, preparing to castle on the king side, is because if they play queen to e2, I'd rather play bishop to e7 in this spot, and I don't want a wasted move. I'd rather have knight to c6, so here knight to c6, and now if they want to play queen to e2, now I can play bishop to e7. So it makes sure that they don't take away any of my tempo in the game. So if we come back early on, that was what happens if they play that knight c3. Another option is to completely avoid what we're doing and play d4. Say if we're going to capture black's material back, let's go ahead and control the center of the board. And then if they want to worry about this d5 pawn, we can just come and capture the pawn on f4. Now, if they play d4, we are just immediately going to take on d5. And they really have two main options here. One is just taking on f4, as we talked about, saying, yeah, I'm not going to worry about the d5 pawn. I'm going to get that material back on f4 and get my dark square bishop involved into the game. From here, that we could play bishop to b4. We've essentially forced them to play knight to c3. It's kind of awkward if you play bishop to f4 and then bring it back to d2. So typically you'll see knight to c3, but we don't even have to take here. We can just maintain the pressure. Reminder that the bishop on f1, the light square bishop, has to move before they can castle on the king side. And so this is really just pinning down this knight. We can go ahead and castle on the king side if we want to. We have great safety here for our king. And then we can get our other material involved into the game. We can get our light square bishop involved into the game. We can play knight to c6. We can take here on c4. So we have lots of good options. Now, if they don't take on f4, another thing that they could try is c5. Just extend on the queen side of the board. They still have the option to attack on f4. But this says, hey, we're not going to allow you to play bishop to d6 and hold down that pawn on f4. So that's one option that they could try. In this case, we're going to play pawn to b6 and just try to blow this up. And it's very difficult for them to really hold on to this. And so that's why I like this. It also opens up for us to get our light square bishop to some other squares. We can always play knight to c6, still attack this square on d4. So that's how I would approach it. The next option, those were all if they play c4 early on in the game. The next variation we're going to look at is if they play knight to c3. Just remember, in the modern defense, if they don't protect this pawn on d5 with the pawn, we're pretty much going to be taking this pawn on d5 with our knight. So we're going to take on d5. Look at a couple options. If they decide to go ahead and take with their knight, that's fine. We take with our queen. And as we looked at in some previous variations, it's very difficult for them to actually deal with this queen in the center of the board. Typically, they like to bring their knight to c3 with development and kick our queen back, but that knight is gone. So how do they really respond? Okay, if they play pawn d4, opening up for the dark square bishop to attack the pawn on f4, we have a couple ways to approach this, but remember, we can now be the aggressor in the game. So we can put max pressure on our opponent. And so in that case, I recommend playing g5. If we want to castle, we can still castle on the queen side, but this, I think, is the best way to actually protect this pawn on f4. And then we can start marching up the board if we want to. Pawn to g4 at some point as well. Really depends on where our opponent goes. Now let's say they don't take with their knights early on. Maybe they play bishop to c4. That's fine. Now we can go ahead and take their knight on c3. Notice how this is a much different setup than before, where I didn't like taking the knight on c3 because I thought it let them off the hook by destroying their pawn chain. In this situation, it's not actually blowing up their pawn chain. Instead, once we take, they can take with their pawn. We can take, exchange queens off the board, and then after bishop to d6, you can see that black is now up a pawn in material. White has double pawns on the c-file, and the queens have come off the board. Black has a clear advantage. Typically, white's playing the king's gambit to give up a pawn so that they have a really strong attack. We've pretty much negated the entire attack. We've come out with the pawn, and we actually have a better setup. So black should have a pretty easy game coming out of here. So that's what happens if they play knight to c3 early on. I don't think it's a very good way to approach it, but you definitely could see it. It's going to be similar to if they play bishop to c4. Same thing. If they don't protect it with the pawn, we're pretty much always just going to be taking with our knight on d5. So once we take, let's look at their options. If they take with their bishop, okay, we can take with our queen. The main difference here is they actually can play knight to c3. So it is slightly better for white. I still think it's terrible. In this case, we're going to play queen to f4, or excuse me, queen to f5. This is the best square for it. Stays relevant in the game, protects the pawn on f4, also attacks the c2 square, which really hinders where this queen can come to. You know, queen to e2, we're going to be blocking it with one of our bishops. We can castle on the king side, and then just max pressure on the c2 square, which is not going to be moving all that much. So that's how we're going to play if they decide to go ahead and play bishop takes on d5. If instead, maybe they played knight to c3, same thing as before. We're not worried about keeping that isolated pawn on d2. Instead, we're just going to go ahead and take. After they take, we're going to exchange, and we're going to play bishop to d6. Very similar that you saw before. The main difference, yes, they do have the bishop on c4. That's fine. We still up a pawn in material, and we have a pretty good position, especially after we castle on the king side. Last thing that you could see is after we play our pawn or our knight taking on d5, they could play pawn d4, trying to attack this pawn on f4. Now we're just going to go and play knight to c6, develop some of our other material in the game. They can castle on the king side. We're going to play bishop here to e6, and we're in a fine spot. Now, some of the threats that we have now, we have knight to e3. This is forking both the rook and the queen. It's also a discovered attack with the bishop on e6. And yes, they can take with their bishop, but then we take back on e3. And we just have so many threats that white has to deal with. Also in this spot, you can see black is up a pawn in material. So white has to really worry about how do they get that material back when they don't really have the initiative. The last variation we are going to go over, instead of the bishop coming to c4, is if they don't try to protect this pawn at all, and they just try to get aggressive and play bishop to b5. Now, you can probably see that knight to c6 is not going to work. Terrible move. We also don't want to block things off with bishop to d7 or even knight to d7. That would probably be the worst of all the options as far as playing it. So we're going to play pawn c6. I think they're pretty much always going to take on c6. And then we're going to take with our knight on c6. Now they have a couple options from here. The first one I think would be pawn d4, just opening up for that dark square bishop to attack the pawn on f4. As soon as they do this, I think we play bishop to d6, defending the pawn on f4. You can see that they can make some big mistakes here. One thing that a lot of players like to do is if you have a piece that's pinned, this knight on c6 is pinned, they like to attack it with another piece. So in that case, d5 makes a lot of sense. Hey, this knight is now trapped. It can't move. It's pinned down to the king. But this would actually be a pretty big mistake because first we can go ahead and take with our knight. And if you look at it, it's like, okay, well, are you really going to allow me to just take your knight here? But as soon as the queen takes, this is a basic concept in chess, but it's the idea of the discovered attack. And so bishop to b4 check, and the queen is going to fall. Pretty much the best move that white has now is just to play queen comes back to d2, and then they're going to lose the queen. So that's going to be a terrible move. They should definitely not do that. So they can't just play d5, although it does look tempting. You're almost baiting them to play that by playing bishop to d6. Instead, they should really just castle. So, castle on the king side, that's completely fine. But let's come back. Let's say instead of d4, they play knight to c6. Okay, well, we can still play our bishop to d6 in preparation if they want to play the pawn pushing forward here to d4. We're going to be castling on the king side in this variation. We're not going to be castling on the queen side. We don't have as much of the initiative as we did before. But you can still see we have a pretty good setup. Both sides are equal in material. We have, once we castle on the king side, we're going to have a lot of safety, and we're not under any threat. This is why the King's Gambit Modern Defense is really thought of a safe defense for black. You don't have to worry about a lot of the crazy lines and the typical King's Gambit variations that you usually see. But it tends to be less popular. I'm not sure exactly why that is. For black, because I do think it plays extremely well. So if you're someone that plays against the King's Gambit a lot, I think you should try to give this one a shot. I think because a lot of white players don't know how to attack it properly, they're really confused when they don't have any initiative at all. So it's a good one. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. I love covering the King's Gambit variations. Again, it is my favorite opening in all of chess, and I just love different ways to attack and defend against it. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, if you wouldn't mind hitting that like button, let me know in the comments below that you enjoyed it. If you have other recommendations on videos, please let me know those as well. Always looking for variations that you guys want me to do a video on. But thanks again for watching. I'll see you in the next video.